Speech starting in three, two, one. Capitalism has sold women a lie that they are liberated at the point in which they put their heads down and keep on working, a lie in which they are told that if they are the workhorse for this rich white man, they will eventually find that freedom they so want, like they so badly crave. We would suggest that is where capitalism has done more harm than good for women, insofar as not only does it encourage and oftentimes force women to feel as if they ought to work harder and harder for an oppressor that tends to proliferate the very same narratives that oppress them. But secondly, we would suggest time and time again throughout the time of history, that is where we've seen that capitalism exacerbated existing norms that women should fulfill a specific role. But secondly, oftentimes remove their ability to be seen as equal in society insofar as the meritocratic standards of capitalism will always hold them shackled. I want to be clear. Capitalism is a system in which profit becomes the main priority in economic systems that capital is used to generate more and more capital to forward your own social status, as opposed to, for example, ensuring subsistence, as opposed to, for example, ensuring survival. But secondly, beyond it being an economic system, it is also one of social value, insofar as what people perceive to be the most important thing in society also fit within what is premium in terms of capitalism, insofar as one, being the most productive person in your workforce. But secondly, it also looks like, for example, being more desirable insofar as you are more rich or have far more capital to do more things. I think it's quite simple. What we would suggest is capitalism, by construction, by design, and in practice, has done more harm than good for women, even if you believe that women have become some degrees of empowered as a result of capitalism, quote unquote, equalizing the field. Before I go on to my argument, I'll take a POI.
What is the counterfactual you were comparing against?
Well, we'd rather have things probably the pre-capitalist societies in which we've had, for example, babay lands or a slightly more equalized playing field, in which, for example, it was not capital that made you more valuable, but rather what you could contribute to society. So, for example, we've seen the division of reproductive labor for women still being valuable, even if it did not necessarily generate capital. We think that is something that's completely fine. We think that is preferable. But to be clear about the burdens, it's not about the counterfactual, but just an assessment of whether or not there's more harm than good that is generated by capitalism for women. First argument, capitalism exacerbates existing norms that women should fulfill a specific role. And I want to frame that prior to capitalism, there were many systems that were not inherently sexist. Look at, for example, pre-colonial Philippines, in which women still had positions of power, whether as religious leaders or even as people who were seen as good warriors, etc., etc. I want to be clear. Capitalism placed a premium more on productive nations and also more on productive individuals in relation to what is viewed as capital or therefore valuable. So why is it uniquely capitalism that therefore puts women in a specific role and harms them? One, it's an inherently more competitive system, which means that no one contributes to the center pool, so your only means of survival therefore is being inherently selfish. And that is why capitalism has led to, for example, men being more selfish as a result of trying to survive, because it is only at the point in which you are able to amalgamate more capital and beat out other individuals that you will be socially praised, that you will have more power, which means that it is specifically the mechanisms of competition that came from capitalism that had encouraged the social stratification of women, of people of color, because to stay on top, they have to be able to push other people down. But second, you gave power to corporations with no moral obligation to anyone, because these groups that have more power, more profit, more capital, that can hold you hostage, have no real reason to care about the average individual, which we see as a real problem today, which is why, for example, they oftentimes fail in, for example, ensuring that women have equal labor rights and ensuring that they're protected in the workplace, because by construction and design, in comparison to governments and other community institutions, they have no obligation to the individual who has unique lives and unique reasons for existing. So a world in which you are taught to value how much someone brings to society is a world in which it's far more difficult for women to assert themselves, insofar as we are seen as less valuable because, one, we have a dip in productivity when we have periods, or two, that when we become pregnant, we are taken out of the workforce entirely. But third, as a result, it inherently devalued reproductive labor that was already uniquely attributed to women. Note that women would always have to become always have to give birth, because by design, men cannot do that, which means that inherently by self-propagation of humanity, that it's inherently quite unavoidable. That is the point in which women just by design cannot therefore be able to be seen as valuable, because it is capital that therefore defines whether or not you are someone who is valuable, who is worthy of praise, or someone who finds meaning. And that is oftentimes why you have things like battered women in the households, because they are not seen as valuable, because what they bring to the table is not seen as something that is putting food on the table in comparison to their male breadwinner counterparts who can do these things because they are not locked by biology to be able to do this. And quite simply, what this therefore means is capitalism isn't just an economic structure, but a social one, which oppresses women by design of what inherently they have to therefore inherit as a result of being a woman. But fourth, capitalism by construction encouraged men to be more selfish, because if they cannot, for example, be praised as much for being a good family man, because that is not what puts food on the table, that is not what gets you the promotion or gets you that Rolex or Mercedes, that is the point in which you will want to try to get as much power as possible, which you are able to do for the reasons we explained above, but therefore mean that you have a far better starting point in comparison to women who have to overcome these expectations of reproductive labor, or for example have to trade that off. But finally, meritocracy advantaged men for the longest time. Men who, for example, could go to trade schools or have apprenticeships in the previous time, therefore, have a far better jump in things like education, and therefore make it far easier for them to be awarded on the merit of, or by the metric of meritocracy, simply because they had a far easier starting point. But finally, we would suggest that capitalism gives a false promise of salvation for these women, which means even if you believe that these women end up entering these spaces in which they can get more money, etc., etc., it is being told that if you put your head down and allow yourself to be abused, or for example, be more docile in the workplace, or for example, be harassed by your boss, is a point in which you can get more money and get more capital. And that is where it actually encourages more and more women to give up pieces of their identity, to be able to do these kinds of things, to be able to amalgamate more power within the capitalist structure, which means that you inherently devalue women or encourage them to trade off very inherent close parts of themselves to be able to do this. I want to be clear. The pursuit of good outcomes was built on the bones of women, that any empowerment that came as a result of capitalism is only curative, but it's not actually comparatively more good, insofar as making women not baby makers does not necessarily mean that the vast majority of our other women are not oppressed by these structures that make them feel as if they have to be exploited to gain any kind of value or societal strength in their lives.
Capitalism at its core is premised on a very simple yet destructive premise, that you as a person ought be valued based on the merit you give to society, the money that you have, and whatever utilitarian value you're able to give back, which is why it benefits CEOs who are predominantly male. It benefits ones that Nessie explains are more efficient, ones that are already rich, who are already and mostly men. When an ideology is so deeply fitted to help and consider those who are the least vulnerable is when it has failed women. The first thing that I want to do is explain the comparative. Why is society likely to turn to more equitable value systems, as what Nessie explains? The first reason is because the meritocratic-based value system is actually the worst out of all potential valuation systems that you could potentially have, which means that pivoting away from it is in itself an inherent good. And the reason for that is because the idea, for example, that individuals had a right to opt into private property, had a right to be able to own certain things, actually worked against women who were seen as property themselves in early capitalist and even to some extent within the pretty recent past. And this is important because it explains why, even within the confines of capitalism and how they perceive women and how it interacted with it, it actually exacerbates the current dynamics that would have had in that particular time slice. But secondly, it's the fact that other values, ones that merited you based on the value and the inherent contribution to bring to society, one that it isn't so hyper-focused on things like money and utility, means that women have a far larger say in what's likely to happen. But secondly, I'd point out that all the research claims and advancement claims that come from opening opposition are non-exclusive. And the reason for that is because research doesn't happen through years of research into a particular topic, therefore you achieve a breakthrough. Oftentimes it's sporadic, it's random, it comes from random people that oftentimes had the idea to be able to create something meaningful, equal. And insofar as that's the case, it means that the ways in which society interacts with research largely remains the same. Like, guys, we invented things like the microwave by accident. We invented things like penicillin by accident. And all of these things are still things that relatively exist to similar extents. And when governments still have incentives to cater to large populaces, is when there's incentives to push this out, regardless of whether or not a capitalist system exists. But thirdly, it's simply what happened in the prior. That is to say that pre-colonial societies, before Columbus came, for example, or before capitalism infiltrated specific societies, is when there was actually an equal distribution of value, both on the roles of men and the roles of women, which is why you see women glorified in so many pre-revolutionary societies that made it so that it was easier for them to be able to voice out their opinions in a way that capitalism destroyed when they shared notions of Westernism, when they shared notions of value and labor and efficiency that structurally Nessie proves tends to benefit men structurally and trends more towards ensuring that they are far better. So on the comparative, it is conclusively better in a world wherein people aren't measured on the value of their money because women are inherently disadvantaged in this valuation system in the first place. The second thing that I want to point out is that capitalistic narratives are often tied into misogynistic ones and often act as an echo chamber in order to enforce one. That is to say that, yes, I'm valuable because I'm rich, but the only reason why I was able to do this was because I'm a man. Therefore, the ways in which I am a valuable person is also directly tied to me being a man and therefore are better, which is often narratives that are peddled throughout history, very softly and even very literally within the capitalist structures that exist within every single MNC and even government in the way that it institutionalizes it within itself. Importantly, at the point at which we explain why this echo chamber narrative oftentimes tends to reinforce itself far more in a world wherein there's an objective metric as to how this is posited, i.e., things like numbers and the amount of money you have, it means that it becomes far more persuasive to other members within society, far less than the counterfactual that we posit to you. So we flip the vast majority of the claims that they bring as to why misogynism and ideas of this become worse insofar as we explain that the comparative is likely capitalism being used as a means to be able to ensure that these things get far worse and far more pernicious. But I'd point out that the capacity to change the system writ large still doesn't exist on their side. Listen to the same examples they give. They say the rural parts of India and therefore the ways in which women are forced into things like slave and the ability to make money are oftentimes harmful practices that were brought up by a need to define yourself by things and through things like money, which therefore led to people operating and trying to take advantage of those most vulnerable within society, would have structurally always been women. So if they talk about the incentive to gain money instead of redistribute it, which would have been far more likely in the comparative, then obviously the ways in which women would have been disadvantaged now become far worse because they're the people that are going to be exploited. They're going to be the people that work within the factories as it exists within the status quo. They're the people that are forced to subpar labor because they are seen as less efficient, as what Nessie already explains. And therefore, the vast majority of the benefits that they talk about and the harms that they talk about flip. But importantly, the ways in which the system changes under capitalist system are largely based on the value and the money that you have, i.e., the precondition to being relevant within policy, even running for a position in the first place, oftentimes requires a large amount of money insofar as that's how society under a capitalist system views it. There are three things that are wrong with this. One, all of the standing material that explains why this is disadvantage against women. But secondly, the fact that the ways in which women are just told to keep their heads down and continue working towards better. Sure, there are some rich women, but they're often outnumbered by rich men that often utilize and leverage this capitalist system and valuation in order to be able to shun out other women, but also have incentives to want to push their own agendas. Importantly, it's also rich women that are ingrained within this and believe that other women underneath them are therefore not working hard enough, and that's why they're stuck within that system. In a world where they're valued for other things, it's when their voices are more likely to be heard, and oftentimes where they coalesce because they themselves believe that it's legitimate. Before I go on closing.
So what is the comparative here? Are you saying is that a feudal woman is better off than a liberal or a money-making woman in modern times? How does this ground this in the modern times? What is the comparative here?
You weren't listening to my speech. Obviously, we explained it's not going to be a woman in the 1600s. It's a woman within the current society and therefore how things have currently progressed, but under a different valuation system. Communism or whatever it is. But what we explain is that any other valuation system would be far better than what capitalism ought to do. But importantly, this is debate winning because we explain why at every inflection point, it worsens things like misogyny. It keeps women and allows the exploitation of individual and vulnerable people, which oftentimes tends to be women within these spaces. But importantly, I'd point out that corporate incentives to do things like push beauty standards in 3 months are so much more likely in a world in which they utilize the ways in which women internalize these narratives and therefore do things like create 3-month things, push them that in the instance that they aren't able to meet these burdens, aren't able to get as much money, push them to opt into these misogynist standards and actually try to go for somebody that could provide for them, which only exists in a capitalist system. Importantly, we demonstrate why the trend of capitalism at every inflection point disproportionately disadvantaged women, exacerbated their conditions, the ways in which they're viewed in society, and the opportunities that they're presented with, because oftentimes that is the case. For all of these reasons, opening government is winning this debate.
I thank Tatiola for their speech. Now I invite the member of government. Here.
Okay. All right. Hello, everyone. Luigi, Hyundai. If you have any POIs, you can raise it in the chat. I'll watch the chat for all of your POIs. That should be good. Also, disclaimer, I'm recording myself as well. If you want to take out a POI, if you're going to raise one and redact that from the YouTube channel, then I'll do that accordingly. Game. It's youtube.com/Luigi Alcaneses for the purposes of the recording. Okay. Yeah, I'll proceed. I'm going to proceed now. I'm going to proceed. I promise. Capitalism impedes in our ability to cooperate with one another. In particular, it impedes in the ability of women to cooperate with each other and advocate together. What is lacking in this debate so far is what does capitalism specifically crowd out and what does it undermine? Our claim is not just socialism and feudalism in general, but it realistically would have been the collective incentive mechanism to pool productive wealth and resources and labor for a community's needs, for women's needs, rather than for wealth to be extracted by other from the system of wealth accumulation. Margaret Thatcher advocated for the property-owning democracy, and as a consequence has created a system of wealth accumulation that favors male property owners and landowners over women, who are dominantly the ones who end up having to pay for those rents as a consequence. For this, my argument is going to be quite simple. Why the system of property accumulation and rent extraction undermines social organizations that are necessary for the social empowerment of women. What our claim is quite simple. Capitalism undermined, or at least it undermines the collective ability for you to organize together, which is the project of you being able to get your contribution and get your value back to yourself. Opening government is only reliant on just explaining productivity, competition, and the system of meritocracy as to why capitalism is necessarily bad, but they fail to talk about the central locus of property accumulation that undermines political and economic advocacy for the leverage of women. There are 3 mechanisms under this. Number 1, the system of inheritance, where women previously did not own property as a consequence of historical bias and also historical exacerbation and exclusion from states and the creation of these states across the world, were incapable of capturing those rents and property accumulation for themselves. Opposition may claim that daughters can benefit and marriage can help women, but this is mitigating at best. It misunderstands that women are fundamentally denied future property and the ability to profit from owning that property, and they are forced to pay increasingly more and more speculative, higher and higher housing prices to more and more pre-existing landowners who don't have an incentive to sell land and are oftentimes exacerbated and supported by the states themselves as a consequence of the fact that they're also tied to the leadership and the ownership over those same governments. This crowded out systems of wealth redistribution and the ability for the state to become more representative and more democratic because they were primarily benefiting towards landowners or on the speculation of the market economy because they earned more and more money from it. Like, for example, through the process of shareholder buybacks, which many companies do around the world to be able to centralize more and more profits to themselves rather than becoming more productive as a company. Number 2, state intervention on property, like any state intervention, if opposition tries to say that they could undermine capitalism by doing that, oftentimes only is very insufficient. It benefits landowners more, like, for example, the help to buy properties and policies that were done in Britain under Margaret Thatcher, which led unintentionally to increases in housing prices for pre-existing landowners. So state subsidies, which otherwise would have been used for redistribution, which is the mechanistic gap that opening government lacks in this debate, were wasted on the fact that you help male individuals and male landowners as a consequence. What this meant was that you crowded out other ways of being able to collective organization or the collective organization of that ownership, like council housing, like cooperatives and irrigation systems in the Philippines, or self-organized systems of ownership like the auto-neurath policies of super blocks in Vienna for those refugees that otherwise would not have been able to buy those houses or those properties for themselves because it was not sustained by private ownership. So we said that this is necessarily good because cooperative cities in New York, for example, they are very, very helpful, right? They're reliant on benevolence, not greed, but also on paying it forward and paying through your own contribution. So it's less reliant on state intervention, which otherwise would be dominated by men individuals, but rather it's dominated by the own contributions of individuals within that community and the shared relationships they have with each other. So even if we have communism on our side, it is necessarily good because it's more leverage on the social relationships and the ties that you have in compassion with one another, which we believe is very fundamental to the human condition, and that is necessarily good for a lot of people. The last reason is this: the capture of rents undermines the social work and the labor of women because landowners charge higher and higher for rents at the expense of the many rent-owning class. As a consequence, in particular, as we've demonstrated in this debate, are dominated by women as a consequence, especially for the acknowledgement of state involvement through, like the payment for the roads and highways that help corporations when they made property there, or for example, reproductive labor and household work, which involved in the increases of prices of houses. So the valuation of women's labor was not accounted for in that process and was not given back to them, and the due compensation was taken away from this process as a consequence of wealth accumulation. So we say this is fundamentally immoral. We say a more democratic system through collective organization would have been better as a consequence in our world. Now let me show how this case responds to opposition. Number one, they say capitalism is necessarily communism is more corrupt as a consequence. If governments are corrupt on either side, our side is better because it is more decentralized, like the systems of example, microfinancing in India, which do not necessitate on owning more and more property and more owning those lands in the payment of those financial institutions, but actually they're more mutual reinforcing, right? They're mutual reinforcing because you rely on low interest rates and you rely on the trust and the ability to cooperate so that you could build your own business and then eventually pay them back and pay each other back in the future. That doesn't necessitate capitalism or property accumulation. It necessitates the collective ability to trust one another as a consequence. We say this is impeded by the capitalist system because of the competitive and collective action problem. It is only mediated by the fact that women are able to organize themselves absent capitalism. So they say, as a second consequence, they talk about innovation. Innovation through the patent system undermines women's contributions in three ways. Number one, the patent system as a function of property is proof of systemic exclusion of STEM subjects, of enabling existing patriarchal forms of ownership over scientific innovations, or even if this is true, women are not meaningfully compensated for this. The patent system prioritizes wealth. I'll take the PY for opening up. Go ahead.
Your case assumes that the distribution process of property being sexist, but that underlying sexist structure and narrative exists on your side of the house too. The difference is that capitalism gives women at least a possibility to climb up.
No, we don't think so. We don't think so. We would say that if it is more decentralized and you are reliant on more benevolent, or at least relatively more benevolent social relationships, like your love for your mom, love for your family, or your love for your community, this is relatively more leverage to the women within these communities as a consequence. Even women's organizing with one another, absent the capitalist system, necessarily involves your ability to trust one another, which is not dependent on a system of land ownership from dominant individuals on your side. So it's not dependent on sexism. Your sexism exacerbated by capitalism itself. So again, the patent system privatizes that wealth. It takes it away from the state. It undermines the state itself and state interventions and social contributions, like the NASA women or the female military engineers that contribute to the GPS and were not compensated for such. And it undermines the property expansion system. Last thing that they say is capitalism has evolved over time. We proved in our case it evolved in a way to serve property owners, which are dominantly men. That is why it does more harm than good, and that is why it has done more harm than good, which is the motion of this debate. So we say at the end of this debate, because we have talked about the most unique thing in property, the most central part of property that is contingent on the case of opening up, very proud to.
So that's good. I prefer POIs in the chat, please. And yeah, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Capitalism single-handedly has changed the trajectory and the lives of women. And I will argue in our case that capitalism is the only force that could have done so. All other possible trajectories, the trajectories that OG says, the mythical trajectory that will maybe bring women to a slightly better position in the end, which they do not trace. I think that even in that case, capitalism creates the best case scenario. And secondly, in the closings case where they talk about cooperations, microfinance, I will argue, are also the byproduct of capitalism, and that is the best case scenario that could have ever existed in the trajectory of women, and capitalism uniquely does so. The opening benches throw out lists and lists of what capitalism has done, could not have done, other systems done. None of that matters, because I will tell you how exactly capitalism uniquely has been able to generate good and how it's able to do so because of how it's conceived as a structure. Right there. Firstly, capitalism creates a class struggle by the way that it's structured. It creates the desire to accumulate and concentrate wealth and property, which necessarily comes at the expense of the working class by putting them to work and exploiting them and accumulating wealth. That creates working class as a distinct group, as an individualized power, who share their traits of working together, collaborating, and be exploited by the capitalist class, allowing them a unique situation for them to collectivize. Realize that CO says that capitalism puts women away, doesn't allow women to collectivize. All systems don't allow women to collectivize because women all over the world share different characteristics, different language, different traits, different experiences, all of that. But capitalism, by creating a class struggle, creates the category of the working class which have shared characteristics all over the world, allowing them to collectivize and unionize to be able to do so. The French Revolution was a result of the aristocratic class there exploiting and creating pushing people and putting them to work. All other struggle, for example, the Vietnamese Revolution in Ho Chi Minh that they raised in a POI, is a result of French imperial, colonial, and capitalist exploitation of the French people, allowing them to collectivize, unique, and fight against. My argument is not that communism good and XYZ bad or good. The claim here is that capitalism, through its exploitative and accumulative nature, creates this conflict, and this conflict in and of itself allows people to come together, unionize, and create the basis of pushback and opposition to capitalism. And it is this struggle and this clash is what creates and generated good in society. This can potentially happen in two pathways, and also true historically. Either one, that you go through the revolutionary pathway and create an alternate system, i.e. a communist society or a non-capitalist society or a slightly less capitalist society. Realize the only way this non-capitalist society can happen and has historically happened is directly a result of capitalism existing. So even if you say that communism, socialism, all that stuff is better and more sexy, it only happens because capitalism is allowing to, through its struggle, creating the space to let that happen in the first place. And therefore, to do that, the Soviet Revolution came to place because of the capitalist war economy going there in allowing workers to collectivize to eventually overthrow the exploitative war economy that was going on place. And all subsequent revolutions have been, a lot of them have been a result of capitalist desire to create imperialist colonial exploitation or even local capitalist exploitation, which have created national revolutions in places. Whether or not they ended up successful or not, but the point is that this schism and this conflict in society has put the limelight on all the harms that systems create, and therefore your desire to sort of rectify this harm. And that creates the other element, the capitalist evil desire to continue to accumulate wealth and continue to hold on to private property. That makes capitalism an adaptive system. Modern capitalism does not look the same 50 or 100 years ago. Modern capitalism has adapted significantly. And why has it adapted? Because of the conflict that it has created. It has created violence, it has created pushback, and therefore capitalism feels the need to sustain itself and adapt. And capitalism is the only system that sort of adapts and has historically adapted, changes itself because of how dynamic it is, because of its desire to maintain markets and its desire to maintain private property. What does that adapting to change and conflict look like? That looks like creating social democracies, or even the modern democracies in the first place, to throw a bone to people who are resisting so that you can continue your resource extraction, your private property. That also looks like microfinancing and banking through the stock market, cooperative systems, and rent control in modern society, because you want to give these things away and give people something to hold on to so that you can continue the core message of capitalism to continue to have private property, to continue to have private enterprise, and to make money. Realize why this is debate winning, and this is unique in its explanation, because there is no other mechanism as to why these cooperative systems, rent control, social democracy could have been created, and there is no alternate trajectory traced out by opening government and neither by closing government. I hope they'll do that in WHIP. Moving on, I think capitalism also created the means and avenues to push evil capitalists to also give away or concede to ideas such as feminism can be sexy and feminism can be cool itself by raising the bar of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. Before I continue, OG, I'll take your point.
So for the longest time, the working class never included women and therefore weren't focused on women and their objectives. Social movements existed regardless, but at least OG uniquely proves why money won't be a prerequisite by which they are listened to, which means that we're prior.
The point isn't that the working class included women or not included women, which by the way is not entirely accurate, but the fact that they clashed with capitalism and pushed back and fought with them and critiqued them extensively pushed the capitalists to give back, to give concessions to the working class or give concessions to other minorities, which includes women, or to create systems that are seemingly representative to continue its ongoing system, the foundations of private property and continued exploitation. Today, the modern capitalist also gives donations, gives money, and funds feminism and feminist movement, at least has the pressure to posture themselves to be feminist and be cool. Why do they do that? Not because they're great people, not because they don't agree in the patriarchy, because capitalism and convinced them in the fundamental message that private property, making money and owning an enterprise is more important, allowing them to concede ground on women's rights and women's suffragette and conceding ground on feminism. There is no other ideology that would have convinced that sexist man and patriarchal feudal aristocrat to ever agree that women deserve a seat on the table. But it is money that has convinced them to do so, which is why closing opposition takes this debate by a great margin.
I thank the member of opposition for their speech. Now I invite the government whip here.
POI's the chat. I'll do my best to take one from each team from up bench. I'll first remove closing op with 6 responses. Their claim is that microfinancing and everything else about class struggle is a product of capitalism. A, this is not the extension from our side. They don't actually respond. It's about collectivization that CO has to trade off, things like union busting and lack of government control. But the actual response is these things about collectivization don't work because it's ahistoric for 4 reasons. And then the other 2 reasons after that. A, aristocracy is not equal to capitalism. It's uniquely industrialization. That means that all the things that we've mentioned, such as the French Revolution that took down the divine right of kings, the Treaty of Versailles safeguarding the right of nation states, national democratic movements that happened post the 1600s, oftentimes existed prior to Adam Smith being able to write capitalism at all. Secondly, Marxism and Das Kapital came before Adam Smith. Marx and Engels were able to write it prior to that. Collectivization has happened among classes prior to it, which means that you cannot equate capitalism as equal to class struggle. In fact, capitalism was a threat to class struggle, and class struggle would have been able to expand a lot more earlier at a point where it was not threatened, not stamped out, and not crowded out in intellectual and academic discussions. Thirdly, many alternatives exist to be able to allow them to gravitate towards each other. Literally, the Indus Valley civilization, Mesopotamia, allowed for the formulation of common states and common place because of geography and the need for you to work together. These things are why you're able to have collectivization. It is quite stupid to be able to claim that only happens with class. But thirdly or fourthly, humans having evolutionary instincts, likely you caring about your family, you having units of control, you having communities with other people also existed because you needed to hunt with other individuals, and that's why oftentimes you have this direct incentive to want to care about other individuals, which means that their claim about how it's the only way to do this is dislodged because you don't have a mechanism to explain why this is a prerequisite for it. But 2 other responses. Even if you have class struggle, note that on op side, you reinforce poor to the rich or power to the rich. That's untrue for that means that on their side, even if you have some power, it's untrue for the women to organize that, as Luigi explained, in inheritance. Notably, we explained why wealth compounds over time at the expense of women, which by the way is stronger than opening government who asserts it's a culture. We explain why inheritance means women pay higher prices, are forced to pay higher rents, and therefore are not compensated for the work they do in their house, flipping opening op as well. That means on closing opposition, they're unable to have that mechanism because even if they have collectivization, it's oftentimes insufficient to be able to stop the speed of capitalism to the extent that it flows, as compared to our alternative, where you're able to hamper it a lot more, or you're able to ensure that there are more collective action resolutions that are able to do it. The final response is directly to the best part of their CO extension, where they say, well, capitalism has a need to sustain itself, and that's why they're going to adopt the change. First, this is so not true. But sure, Sio, go ahead. Sio?
So your comparative is by throwing examples of prehistoric society where only 100 or 200 people lived in that particular system. How does that onto modern where thousands and millions of people collectivize in a singular situation? How does that trace to the kind of
we
system
wouldn't
we're
have
talking about?
had as a large number of population absent capitalism potentially with industrialization, which means a lot of it is a lot easier. But also, secondly, I don't really understand why there's such a harm. It's perfectly fine as a structure of governance for women. Their claim is that capitalism sustains itself and therefore changes. I lied. There are two other responses aside from that. A, the desire to maintain private property doesn't distribute to socialization. It's actually the opposite. And that's why the maintenance of that power likely means that you're not able to change itself because you want to keep that structure as a whole. But secondly, assuming you can do it, it could happen. But the problem is CO and OO never supply why it's true. We explain three mechanisms of inheritance, rent-seeking behavior, as well as why you're unable to opt out of it, particularly because it crowds out any government control, which means the opposition side, at best, you undermine other efforts to combat it at the point where it becomes less relevant. That takes out CO. How do we weigh against opening government? Note the alternative they assert is pre-colonial histories where they're supposedly more progressive. There is no mechanism for this. At best, OG at DPM asserts that capitalism is bad, so they would have turned to this regardless. It's unclear why that's true. They then say that governments care about redistribution. Unclear why that's true. Luigi supplies the actual reason for why that's likely to happen. And finally, they say, well, they're historically progressive, such as in the Philippines. Not really true. I mean, I'm also Filipino. But more crucially, they're also very vulnerable to opening up, who says that it's uniquely hampered within specific areas. Luigi supplies the actual comparative and explains why the likely counterfactual, both in my contributions in the POI and the responses, but also in the explanation for uniquely why you're able to actually do this. Their mechanism is about how you're not able to do it at all because you probably are just going to give more women rights. Uniquely, closing government unlocks it when we explain why in the alternative, maybe it's still imperfect, maybe you still have, as opening opposition points out, gender roles. But the point is that you give women more ability to feel comfortable in that because you tell them that they are able to have these social connections. But more crucially, we leverage these social connections more individually. And as closing opposition helps clarify for us, because these structures and societies are smaller, it's a lot easier for them to be able to move out. That's a greater form of solvency and comparative that opening gov doesn't fulfill in a more harm than good debate. But secondly, their mechanism for oppression is that women are judged purely on utility. OG's own mech of how this interacts with the patriarchy makes it change very, very minimal because they're vulnerable to the OO criticism about how gender norms and gender roles happen regardless. That means their benefit is incredibly uncertain. On the comparative, closing gov has better capacities. First, MG fills the gap about property accumulation, crowding out any form of state welfare, e.g. Reaganism in the US or crowding out interventionist states in the late 1800s. This explains alternatives and stronger mechanisms than opening government. Second, MG's explanation of laissez-faire and the free market discouraging state intervention is where there's actual change. When our alternative proves to be more socialized and you have more states willing to intervene to create welfare, it's better for women, and notably it's a prerequisite to opening opposition's case of development because you're not willing to create development at a point where there is no state intervention, and that's why it's oftentimes privatized and therefore doesn't help the vast majority of people, specifically women intersectionally. But finally, MG gives the mechanism of eliminating rent seeking and wealth accumulation through inheritance. The largest reason why women are predominantly locked out are because of the locked structures of inheritance. We explain why that's more liberated. That allows us to win against opening government because we have more certain impacts and we better make it out. How does it win against opening opposition? Note that opening opposition claim is that, well, it's going to be bad because the case of liberalism is that the alternative being divine right of kings and also capitalism working with meritocracy happens relatively. I've already destroyed the first alternative about how it's a divine right of kings. I just wanted to set out divine right of kings was already destroyed by French Revolution, Treaty of Versailles, national democratic movements. That doesn't matter too much. What I want to point out is on op side, they operate on an incorrect comparison of housework and feudalism. We outweigh why, even if the structures they form are meritocratic, it impedes cooperation among different women as well because it crowds out any other narrative. This is a prerequisite for competition. You will leave behind women who are most vulnerable and therefore you lose real innovation to be able to help them out. But secondly, even if they don't get to move up on our side, we explain why we get more comfort. DLO's final engagement is, well, governments are insufficient and corrupt and there's no incentive to innovate on our side. I'll observe DLO says in response to opening gov that they will compete regardless, which concedes the extension. But secondly, government inefficiency happened within capitalism now because it encouraged rent-seeking behavior. In the comparative, Luigi explains why governments are likely to be better at the point where you allow more individuals to be able to participate. That is why you're able to have better scrutiny and better government. But secondly, in the worst-case scenario, we can cop the harm of some inefficiency if it allows for protection of gender minorities and women when it's socialized. We don't fully deal with misogyny, but at the very least, we safeguard feminist power, and that's good. But finally, efficiency and quick innovation only allows men to move up. Luigi explains why that's far worse on upside. For those reasons, CG wins.